Yeah, a few weeks ago, while visiting a sister to go through pictures, papers, and things her father had left behind, we came across a Christmas letter our mother had written in 1972. That was my freshman year at the Ohio State University. And Mom reminded me that my intent had been to double major in philosophy and psychology. Back then, I would say naively that my goal was to understand consciousness. Not long after Christmas, I became intrigued by a course called psychophysics, offered in the welcoming department of biophysics, where I was introduced to Karl Kornecker, who, when I stated my interest in consciousness, looked at me intently and said, "The brain has something to do with it." This made a strong impression, and I intuited that perhaps consciousness goes all the way down, so that exact sciences, including math, physics, molecular biology, and neuroscience, must be added to psychology and philosophy. Thus, I declared a single major in biophysics, and upon graduating, was happy to continue a PhD track in this friendly transdisciplinary niche at Ohio State. Something called brain theory became my area of interest, and I targeted the question, if the brain is a natural solution, then what is the problem it solves? This led to a proposal in 1980 called Adaptive Modes of Rational Consciousness to develop a formal theory of cognitive affective agents that is an optimization-oriented framework to specify abstract rational functions that our developing human brain should satisfy. However, what data could possibly support or falsify such a theoretical framework? My proposal fell flat because it wasn't bona fide biophysics. Shortly thereafter, I met Ross Mooney, who was a real godsend, a one-of-a-kind emeritus professor who had specialized in helping grad students navigate their independent research. He generously shared himself in one dialogue session after another, kind of like an academic therapist, and helped me to reflect deeper beneath my academic question about the brain's problem. Who was asking this question, and why was he interested? After a summer spent alone on a Canadian island to get back on track, I returned to write at night in my father's office using a mini computer-based, this was in the 80s, a word processor. While writing in this way, which was novel back then and out of phase with daylight, it seemed that the words appearing on screen and recorded on disk were manifestations of my brain attempting to understand itself. I also used the word processor to write letters and felt a deep connection between the two modes of writing, the self-reflective mode and the other communicative mode. I argued that the recorded words could be regarded as bona fide brain data and made a second attempt in 1983 called epistemological brain function theory. Not surprisingly, in retrospect, this too fell flat. Words do not qualify as brain measurement data. Where to next? Thanks to multiple converging events and persons, I transitioned to quantitative brain phenomena called event-related potentials, which combine EEG, electrical brain waves, and computer-based psychological tasks. After learning to assemble spare equipment in a biophysics storage room, I moved on to collaborate with a cognitive psychologist who is expanding his human performance lab to include ERPs, that is, event-related potentials. Then, in 1990, another psychology professor, the late John Cacioppo, who co-founded the field of social neuroscience, introduced me to Steve Sands, who had started a business expressly to serve brain researchers by providing flexible EEG acquisition and analysis systems with synchronized visual and auditory stimulation. Steve, who was himself a psychology professor at the University of Texas at El Paso, hired me with a plan to complete my doctoral experiments at his 32-channel EEG lab. Less than 1 year later, thanks be to God and to many others, at last I had acquired suitable biophysical data relevant to human cognition in the field of ERP research. My dissertation developed methods to study missing stimulus potentials, which are emitted when expected events do not occur. By contrast with ERPs evoked by stimulus events, MSPs are clearly endogenous. Previous research had identified two major components, so-called components called N200 and P300, which are emitted about 200 milliseconds and 300 milliseconds respectively after the time of an expected event. Because the brain processes underlying these two components are weakly coupled, they can be teased apart or deconvolved, with results shown on the right here. I noted that ERPs have a kind of amphibious quality that can be interpreted in two distinctly different ways, reflecting underlying cognitive algorithms like expectation versus biophysical current sources which generate these potentials. And this could in turn motivate a quest for a unified cognitive biophysical framework. So in retrospect, my three attempts might be classified in terms of arrows between first person, second person, and third person perspectives. Attempt number one originated from my own subjective experience as a rational agent and intuited an abstract framework that was intended to fit others besides myself. Thus, the arrow went from first person to third person. Yet, numerous second-person dialogues were implicit in the background. Attempt number two began by reflecting on word processing text I in my brain had written, and it moved toward communicative dialogue with other persons. Thus, the arrow went from first person to second person, yet third-person linguistic semantics were understood implicitly in the background. Finally, attempt number three began by recruiting persons willing to participate in the missing stimulus ERP experiment, enlisting their informed consent, and then it digitally recorded 32 electric potential measurements on their scalps per millisecond in sync with visual stimulus events. Thus, the arrow went from second person, you, an informed, willing participant, to third person, quantified, objectively recorded EEG measurements. Crucially, the third attempt eliminated my first person perspective insofar as possible. However, as Ross Mooney emphasized repeatedly, the researcher himself or herself is always implicit in the background. Thanks to those humbling delays in the 1980s, I came in sync with the neuroimaging zeitgeist of the 1990s, designated as the decade of the brain. The 90s indeed witnessed major advances in non-invasive human brain imaging. Functional magnetic resonance imaging, abbreviated fMRI, was conceived in 1990 and born in 1991. Like structural MRI, functional MRI relies on a quantum mechanical property of nuclear magnetic resonance, whereby protons and hydrogen atoms, precessing like tops, align their spins with a slightly higher probability in the same versus the opposite direction of a strong magnetic field. There's a great website I recommend called MRIquestions.com that has excellent explanations about MRI and fMRI. fMRI rapidly became the dominant neuroimaging modality due to its unsurpassed spatial resolution of roughly 1 millimeter. However, its temporal resolution is sluggish, a few seconds, due to its dependence on blood oxygenation. On the other hand, magnetoencephalography, or magnetic brain waves, abbreviated MEG, and we had a great poster presentation on that last night, has millisecond temporal resolution. The speed of thought, you might say, albeit with ambiguous spatial resolution. Pioneered by David Cohen at MIT, in 1968, MEG had matured as a scientific instrument by the early 1990s, whereas both MRI and MEG instruments rely on quantum principles. EEG instruments, having been pioneered in 1924 by Hans Berger in Germany, are classical. But EEG also took a quantum leap in the 90s. Modern engineering advances with analog devices, analog to digital conversion, and real-time digital signal processing enabled Ron Stubers and Steve Sands and their team to deliver the first 256-channel EEG system with continuous 1 millisecond timing to Tom Nakata, an MRI researcher at Niigata University in 1998. Now let's fast forward to the 20-teens. The NIH-funded Human Connectome Project was a massive, funded here, just right around the corner, but performed mostly in Minnesota and St. Louis, was an exemplary effort to accelerate advances in human neuroimaging, particularly for measures of brain connectivity, to apply these advances to a large number of healthy young adults, and to freely share the data and tools with the scientific community. The HCP has had a lasting impact as researchers continue to reanalyze the data in new ways. In 2016, the HCP consortium published this highly impressive parcellation of cerebral cortex into 180 homologous brain areas per hemisphere. That is right and left hemispheres, 360 areas in total. So-called task negative areas shown here in dark shades become more active together after externally oriented sensory and motor tasks have come to completion. These areas form an extensively studied whole brain network that is called the default mode network. On the left, a diagram by Margulis et al. Summarizes an analysis of functional connectivity gradients that situated the default mode network relative to other major functional networks at a central apex, which is abstracted from the here and now, and thereby can facilitate creative exploration of alternative behavioral choices. On the right, Alves et al. Show several fiber pathways which connect nodes of the DMN. They improved and extended these anatomical maps by using each individual's own functional space. In a similar vein, Lauren DeNicola and colleagues used fMRI to study the default node network intensively in individual persons as opposed to averaging across persons in a group, in which the group averaging process blurs individual differences. As shown here for one person, they found that the DMN comprised two side-by-side networks, they called them A and B, in parallel across the nodes. Now, this is a whole brain network, so every node in this network has sort of these, you can tease it apart into two nodes side by side. Network A was associated with remembering past episodes or with imagining future episodes, detached from the present, typically from a self-oriented perspective. By contrast, network B was associated with something called theory of mind, whereby one seeks to understand another person's behavior in terms of their perceived values, beliefs, and capabilities. When Lauren presented this at a recent meeting, I conjectured sitting there in the audience, that network A might be a first-person network, and that network B might be a second-person network. Then she presented a new result showing a third side-by-side network related to language, which I conjectured might be a third-person network oriented to things we talk about out there. If this simplification holds any water, then perhaps the DMN's primary function is to integrate these three complementary perspectives. fMRI has an impressive 1 millimeter cubed spatial resolution, but just to get really humble and amazed, this science publication by researchers at Harvard and Google takes a deep dive into that 1 millimeter cube using a tissue sample donated by an epilepsy patient. They used electron microscopy and automated computational reconstruction. The pyramidal cells, these are called pyramidal cells because the cell bodies are kind of like shaped like pyramids. They're packed into a 3D matrix that comprises a network of blood vessels here, relevant to the fMRI signal, and many other cell types. Zooming in, about 150 million synaptic connections. This is in the 1 millimeter cube that fMRI reads out as like a single number. 150 million synaptic connections were reconstructed. The result requires about 1,400,000 gigabytes of data storage. But the reality goes even much, much deeper than this reconstruction, which doesn't get down to ion channels, and it totally misses what's going on from 1 microsecond to the next. Let's switch gears and consider EEG and MEG, which have millisecond temporal resolution. Here we see a friend of mine who volunteered to participate in a simultaneous EEG and MEG recording while his hand received somatosensory stimulation, like little electric, not just maybe just a little electric feeling there, not a real shock. Since MEG and EEG are generated by sources of the same kind, namely macroscopic ionic currents, they often share sources in common. Here we see the primary co-resonant mode for my friend's somatosensory brain response with MEG shown on the top with picotesla units. You can't really see that, but that's picotesla. These are picotesla. And EEG on the bottom with microvolt units. This particular source is modeled nicely as a simple current dipole, which generates complementary electric and magnetic fields, which you can kind of see there by using the right-hand rule there. There's electric and there's the magnetic curling around like that. EEG and MEG measurements outside the head are not intrinsically interesting. We want to know what's going on inside. However, Hermann von Helmholtz proved in 1853 that a current distribution inside a volume conductor cannot be solved for uniquely, even given complete knowledge of the outside electromagnetic field. So, what can we do? We can add extra constraints based on prior knowledge and hypotheses. But note that each way of constraining the problem provides a different family of unique solutions. Therefore, in this EEG-MEG field, there are lots of different methods for solving the inverse problem. But an outline for all of these, we construct a space of feasible source models. Then we use laws of electromagnetism, which are, in this case, biologically simplified Maxwell's equations. They're highly simplified versions of Maxwell's equations, but they're reductions. Plus numerical solver to forward calculate the electromagnetic fields that resolve from sources in the model space. So that's first step is to do this forward calculation. Finally, we derive an inverse calculation in a statistical algebraic framework in order to estimate the interesting unobserved, I should say, sources on the inside, starting with the uninteresting measurements on the outside. More specifically, we use structural MRI to model brain and head tissues. Then we construct a forward matrix by solving the green highlighted partial differential equations for all so-called primary sources. Next, we use the yellow circled formula to construct an inverse matrix from the forward matrix plus assume constraints. Finally, we estimate sources in the brain by applying the inverse matrix to experimental data outside the head. Setting the math aside, we can think of this in terms of Plato's famous analogy, allegory, which wasn't intended for this purpose, but basically, if we think of the shadows here, these are the measurements. Behind the scenes are what the brain activity. So that's like EEG and MEG. But fMRI, there might be some echoes in the cave, and the echoes have some time delay. So it's an interesting analogy for our case. I'm going to skip this one in the interest of time, unless someone has a question about it. This idea of the hollow universe by Charles de Koninck, who is a Catholic philosopher of science. And now I'll connect a little bit with Father Anselm's talk here. We have a dissonance here in the philosophy of cognitive neuroscience. Namely, there are high ethical standards required by the Belmont Report to conduct research that fully respects the dignity of the human participants as well-informed autonomous agents, versus a neuroscientific explanatory framework which has no room for freedom of choice. In particular, few researchers have conducted, well, Father Anselm talked about this and about the researchers, and also Father Anselm mentioned Alfred Mealy, and there's a YouTube presentation on this that is very interesting. Goes through some of the other experiments besides the Libet experiment. But how to reconcile the ethics of autonomous agency with the metaphysics of naturalistic explanations? Well, interestingly, there's a growing trend to use quantum theory to explain various anomalous phenomena in human decision experiments, such as violations of classical probability, order effects. For example, if you have a questionnaire, the order of the questions matters. Your answers might change depending on the sequence of the questions. Also, modification of behavior due to experimental observation. The experiment itself changes your behavior. So various heuristics have been put forward to explain these effects, but quantum theory seems to provide a unified framework to account for these. So in addition, quantum theory can comprehend psychological states of uncertainty, ambiguity, and conflict. So researchers in this field use quantum theory as a formalism to explain what they call quantum-like phenomena without claiming that the brain itself is a macroscopic biophysical quantum system. So quantum theory doesn't solve the philosophical problem of free will, but importantly, it can respect autonomous agency. So I'm going to skip this slide in the interest of time. There are two interesting senses of what's called neuroethics. This slide. I might skip this one also in the interest of time. There it is, this one. Actually, I walked here with a student here who just completed her freshman year, which is when I was thinking back 53 years. And I sort of did this little thought experiment. What would I do if I could go back 53 years and restart again? And these were some thoughts I had. I would have a computational EEG lab that collaborated with MRI and MEG people, and we'd model the human default mode network millisecond by millisecond, as opposed to fMRI is very sluggish. I'd like to be in dialogue with the neurophilosophers of all stripes and neuroethicists, and promote this utter respect of the selfhood of the human person. This, I don't know if anyone's come across this book by, if you're from Franciscan University, you probably have, John Crosby, The Selfhood of the Human Person. From that point of view, I recommend this book. And then the other thing I would do is, there's something seems to be emerging called neurophenomenology. And Father Anselm mentioned Edmund Husserl, who is, I think, probably considered the founder of this field, and our own saint, Edith Stein, Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, has written. She was a student of Husserl, his assistant. She wrote her doctoral dissertation on the problem of empathy, and she also wrote this couple treatises on philosophy of psychology and the humanities. I've just started to dip into this. It's good. So that's another thing I'd like to do if I could start over again. And finally, the multi-level quantum foundations. It's intriguing to consider how the quantum mechanical formulation might work. So, okay, I'm done, right? It's time, yeah. It's time. Okay, well, this was my parting thought, but on Psalms 19 and 139 in this first person, second person, third person framework. But sadly, that's the end. Okay. Thank you so much.
I think we can take time for one, maybe two questions.
Would your slides be available?
I can make the slides available for sure with some of the links and so forth. Yeah, I'll do that.
Thinking back to your slide on quantum and like sort of statistical, this book, I'd like to know your thoughts on my assessment of, seems to me like in between the quantum level and behavioral experiments, EEG, fMRI, there's so many different layers of scientific disciplines, of biophysics, physiology, behavioral studies, and do you feel like it's okay to sort of jump from the quantum level all the way up to the behavioral level, or why isn't there more work to kind of use the full stack and try to get each of these disciplines talking to each other and working their way up and down? What's your thoughts on that?
That's a great question. I mean, that's kind of what I had in mind for this one here, multi-level. But it's interesting that so these researchers, Joan Busemeyer, who's at Indiana University, Zheng, she's goes by Joyce. She is at the Ohio State University. They don't claim that the quantum mechanical formalism requires going all the way down to quantum mechanics in physics. But they have things like a behavioral double slit experiment. You can kind of imagine what that is. It's like you have a decision coming on. Am I gonna do right, or am I gonna do left? Am I gonna do right, or am I gonna do left? And then you decide. And then they analyze the experiment, like reaction times and statistics and things like that. And then they can compare that one with classical models. And importantly, the quantum mechanical way of computing probabilities is different from the classical way of computing probabilities. So the formalism kind of works. And then, but how does it go? Like if it goes all the way from cognition here and it works there, and it works all the way down for nuclear spins and MRI and so forth, what's going on in between? I think that's a great question.
Okay, so it sounds like they're using modeling tools without necessarily looking to find mechanistic causes and a chain of mechanisms. They're just using a sort of frameworks of modeling tools.
Well, is quantum mechanics a modeling tool? I mean, so the one thing they do is with in behavioral experiments, that someone got a Nobel Prize for this, Tversky, who did economic experiments, showed that, well, our decisions when we do make economic kinds of decisions aren't rational in the sense of classical probability. But you can use the formulation of a quantum probability. So in other words, using subspaces of Hilbert spaces instead of subsets of events to explain is one way of trying to explain what's going on in these anomalous phenomena.
Thank you.
Follow up on Jeff's question. It sounds to me like they're not doing quantum mechanics. They're not applying quantum mechanics. They're not deriving anything from quantum mechanics. What they're doing is finding some analogies of something at the psychological level with things at the quantum level. So I think what this sounds like just an analogy, not real quantum mechanics, not physics.
True, it's not physics, but they use the formalism. They even go in, I didn't say anything about the dynamics, but they use Hamiltonians and they use Hilbert spaces. They use.
But what I'm saying is they're not deriving those formalisms at the psychological level from physics. They're finding phenomena that can be mathematically modeled in a way that resembles what's happening in physics at the subatomic level, but they're not going from the subatomic level and deriving these Hilbert spaces and so on.
Right. Yeah, absolutely true. And but the claim is that that all these anomalous cognitive phenomena, like violations of the law of total probability and so forth, versus using quantum probabilities to explain them. There's quantum formalism provides a unified framework for explaining various cognitive anomalies, whereas using classical probabilities and Bayesian statistics, for example, you have to come up with a different heuristic to explain each one. So, okay, thank you.